cosmic storm. Floating on whimsical wavelengths is the norm. Dancing through the stars, chasing spectrums of light. Riding the waves that are just out of sight.
It's time for Whimsical Wavelengths again, and this time a different type of paper, one that turns the lens on the degree process itself. Just before we get going though, if you've got the time, the space, you're not driving, drop a review on Apple or a rating on Spotify or whatever app you're using. It really does help the show and gets it out to even more people to discover it. Okay, so a scientific discipline that does not have a diverse group is missing out. Missing out on ideas, perspectives, and cognitive diversity. The unique ways different minds solve complex spatial puzzles. In some fields, part of the education happens away from the classroom, sometimes in a literal field. There has always been a mantra that to do fieldwork, you need to be a certain way. Be able to hike up hills, handle being beside traffic-heavy roadways, to look at rock cuts. We've treated the outdoors as a character-building rite of passage, rather than a classroom. Perhaps I should go on a rant of what fieldwork typically is in industry. Longtime listeners have heard it before. It's long days in rugged terrain, often in the very remote locations, dealing with helicopters, bugs, and animals. But most importantly, not all geoscience is that. Not all geoscience work or discovery happens under those conditions. That is incredibly important to recognize. Because if the field is a barrier, we're not just losing students, we're losing the future of geosciences. Bringing in students with sensory, cognitive, and physical disabilities into academically rigorous ways needs to be part of moving the education forward. And if we do so, it leads to better departments and a healthier, more innovative discipline. Today, we will explore a paper centered around a workshop held right here in Vancouver, where multi-sensory engagement and flexible delivery proved that accessibility doesn't mean compromising academic merit. In fact, it often enhances it for everyone. I absolutely have the appetite to dig into this topic. I refuse to take education for granted. It belongs to all of us, although perhaps it needs a little metamorphism to reach its final form. To explore this topic, I have a guest coming in to discuss how physical changes to fieldwork, careful planning, and the changing of perceptions are all integral to this endeavor. Today's guest is an expert in his field, pun intended, and a master at field teaching. Please welcome Brett Gilley, a professor of teaching at University of British Columbia.
Hello.
Okay, I figured I'd start by embarrassing you, at least buttering you up. You sport an impressive 96% and of would take again at ratemyprofessor.com with comments like great teacher and comedian. So I'm definitely looking forward to your ending punchline. But to start, I thought perhaps the best place is, what is teaching to you, or your take on pedagogy?
Teaching is what I love. And Rate My Prof is always amusing. You get the people who love you and the people who hate you. And at least from my perspective, I always think the people who love me can't spell. So it says something about their abilities. But yeah,
I got to interject you right there because I can't spell. I have a PhD and I literally took geophysics because I couldn't spell. I did not want to take anything to do with biology because I figured that's 50% of my mark gone like that. So I have a big heart for all of those who can't spell.
I say it lovingly because I am one of them.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's just sort of it's an interesting, we spend a lot of time talking about teaching and teaching evaluations and those sorts of things. And people talk about teaching as if they're an objective measure, but teaching evaluations are done by 18 to 22-year-olds who don't necessarily have a huge amount of perspective or life experience. And so it's one of those things that I rail against sometimes. But yeah, teaching is something that I love. It's a huge part of my job. And, I think that earth science is something that everybody should do and everybody should learn. And, you'd hope that that's what most people feel like when they're a teacher, that they love teaching their subject. But I just feel like I'm really gifted that I get to share what I love and watch people experience it. And everybody can do it. I end up with a lot of students who are very... they have imposter syndrome, and they often come to us as if this is the science that they've been dreading. And, I'm not good at science. And I'm like, well, that's not really... There's not like a gene for science, And it's just the way they've been taught and the way they understand knowledge. They come in very apprehensive. And part of what I love is being able to show these people that, oh no, you live on the earth. You love the earth. The earth is really cool. And you can do this. It's a good job.
See, right there, obviously you're railing and being, what's the word, humble about your 96%, but I mean, right there, it kind of says the same. You're not funny yet, though.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Gravity sucks.
Oh, that hurts. That hurts. That hurts so much.
That's my favorite joke in lecture because it's so bad.
Well, you gotta have at least a picture of a kid standing there with an ice cream on the concrete, right?
Well, I actually prefer just leaving it there because what happens is it's such a bad joke that it's not actually funny, and usually 3 or 4 weeks later a student will come up and say, I didn't get your gravity joke. And I get to explain, gravity sucks, like down. And they're like, oh. And they've been lying awake at night wondering why they didn't get the joke. It's just because it's so stupid.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite jokes.
Yeah, me too.
And we've had some really good ones on the podcast, so I'm really looking forward to yours. But
I should have saved it.
You probably should have. The paper at the center of this episode starts with a problem, and I think let's start there. Mm-hmm. This isn't the first discussion here on the podcast, Whimsical Wavelengths, touching on the subject of how do we learn? How do we point the camera or the lens or the telescope back at the scientist? Mm-hmm. Previously on this show, it was wrapped up in identity of astronomy and science more generally. Earth science is suffering from a recruitment problem writ large. What is the biggest problem with this in your eyes?
It's an interesting problem, and we say regularly that we aren't going to be able to produce enough geologists to replace retirements. And I have kind of been hearing that my whole life, and we seem to still have a field. But there's this idea that we need more geoscientists than we are producing. And part of that's just because, in 1905, someone in Chicago decided that instead of doing natural history, they were going to do biology and leave geology out, and then the whole world followed them. So we don't have a lot of earth science in high schools in that way. And the earth science we do have in high schools is sort of billed as, oh, you're no good at science, you should do this, it's easy. It's just rock collecting, which really troubles a lot of my colleagues. I kind of like it. It's nice. I talk to my friends in math, for example. The first year of university is really year 13 for math. And you can't diagnose if someone missed something key in grade 5 and just could never do it after that and were, decided that they couldn't do it. That's really hard to diagnose, whereas we could be fairly confident that most of our first year students are learning about a lot of this stuff the first time. And I think in some ways that's quite freeing. And it means that I can really spend my time teaching, trying to convince people that, oh, you're just majoring in the wrong thing and this is awesome. And so I kind of like that, but I do recognize it would be easier to fill those positions if we had more people coming from high school. But I'm not sure that it's that bad, honestly.
I guess it depends also what the industry is doing at a particular time, because I know in the case of the current moment, everyone is hiring. If you have a degree, you obviously don't sound like your brain is on stun. You will get hired.
if you've taken a single geology course and you don't drool at the interview, you are welcome for the summer work. Like, I've talked to some companies that are hiring hundreds of students this summer. And obviously it's very cyclical. Like in the year I graduated in the late 90s, nothing. Oil was down, mining was down, environmental science was just picking up. Like, there was really nothing. Several of my friends became baristas and had to come back to geology 5 or even 10 years later. So this is a good time for our students, and it helps us. We are in a bit of a competition when it comes to choosing majors at the University of British Columbia. They choose their specialization at the end of first year, and so we spend a lot of time around now talking to students who are frantically trying to make the right choice, and a crazy number wants to go into computer science. Well, it's nice for us to be able to say, we have exactly the same salary structure with a very high starting salary and potential for, stratospheric salaries. And also, you're probably likely to get a job if you do geology.
Yeah. What about the whole thing that there is a significant push, and it's a lot to do with how we fund education and other things at the post-secondary level, so universities and colleges, that we're having closures and a reduction in the number of faculty, and yet you still have this push for making sure we have people to be able to fill these positions.
Yeah, it's fairly dark times in post-secondary right now. A lot of that's related to the ways that the international student caps arrived in the last couple of years.
Sure, but it's not just Canada. It's also Australia. It's the U.S. It's basically all of the Western world.
Yeah, and we fund the universities strangely. Like, they are clearly a net benefit to society to have a well-educated populace, but it's not popular for anyone to give more money to the universities. And so in BC, for example, and much of Canada, the way we've been able to increase funding is to bring in more international students. And so in the last couple of years, when that gets hobbled, it's very difficult. Universities are, like UBC is the 800-pound gorilla, right? Like, our enrollments went down, well, we'll lower our entrance requirements slightly and steal all the students from all the other institutions. So the two-year schools and the newer, smaller universities are really struggling right now. And some of them, especially the ones that were sort of overextended on international students, are, there's layoffs in permanent faculty, which is not yet resolved into the universities.
On that dark moment, let's start moving towards something that actually is a bit more touchy-feely, or at least feels good, in the sense that diversity and inclusion in any discipline is absolutely important. And hugely. I can't plant the flag any harder than those words, perhaps, unless I literally start drumming the earth. I have attempted to make the case for this, but what does it mean to you? Why is it important, or rephrase it more classically, for any, discipline? Why should we care?
I mean, when you talk about the success of groups, what you want, a successful group has diversity in it. People coming from different ideas, coming from different places. You're going to have a group that comes with more stuff. If everybody's the same, they're all going to come up with the same solutions. It's not going to be as good. And so in geoscience, for example, we've struggled a lot with a lack of diversity. When chemistry makes you look good, for example, for accessibility, that's not a great sign. Like, all they have to do is slap in a low desk and they call it a day. But for us, having somebody with a mobility disability out in the field can be very challenging, right? And the knee-jerk reaction of many professors is to say, I'm sorry, you just can't come. Whereas it's a lot easier in a lot of other institutions. But because fieldwork is a central focus of our discipline, we're necessarily obsessed with about that. And that resolves itself in strange ways.
All right, and I'll come back to some examples or some comparisons to other fields in a moment. But now to the paper, or the papers, if you will, making geoscience fieldwork inclusive and accessible for students with disabilities is the title of at least one of them. And the two of them together look at the process or the event from two different viewpoints. So setting it up briefly in 2 to 3 sentences, what was the event?
So we did an accessible field trip as part of a geologic conference in Vancouver several years ago. And the whole point was to bring students with disabilities together with professors and to sort of show best practices for having an accessible trip. That was the goal. Of course, everything immediately goes off the rails. What we discovered is we had some students with disabilities, some without, but we ended up with a lot of professors with disabilities who wanted to join the trip as well. And so already our perspective was too narrow. And we ended up with many people with many different disabilities on what you would normally call a first-year field trip up to Whistler and back.
Just because I know the corridor relatively well, because I live in, obviously, I think I can easily walk to your house, actually.
Probably, if you're near SFU still, yeah.
So was this like to see, just to keep people in the mind that geology, you go out and see the rocks? Are we talking about some of the basaltic columns? Like what other things are you seeing along this particular...
So we do it as an integrated trip that can include most of the first year courses in our Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science department. So we can bring in different things. You know, we start off at Stanley Park on the beach, looking at beach processes and combining that with winds and storms. And, you know, we go up and we look up the lower mainland at Cypress Mountain. We go look at landslides. We look at glacial stuff. You know, we look at a whole variety of things. And it's just because we're lucky enough that we can look at all those things on a very simple trip. I mean, I literally did this on Saturday. We went just past Squamish and back. We left at 9. We were home by 4:30. We're really blessed with how much geology we can access so quickly.
Yeah, there's a reason why we call it beautiful British Columbia. Or
That's
did we
right.
switch it to supernatural? Anyway.
Probably both.
Okay, so how does this make it, like just in general, we'll get into more of the details eventually, but like how does this more accessible?
So, I mean, there's a certain point where I should take a step back and talk maybe about how I even got involved in this. I was at the Geologic Society of America conference and I met a guy and then we'd been talking about stuff and he said, I'm presenting. I said, I'll go watch your presentation. And he was presenting on his PhD work where he took 8 quadriplegic and paraplegic students into Mammoth Cave, which was not accessible at that time, and had them doing mapping. And I was watching this.
Whoa, wait, just for the listener, what is Mammoth Cave?
Mammoth Cave is a gigantic cave complex in the southeast U.S. It's one of the biggest in the world. And
Caves
they actually took... Pardon?
Caves formed by...
Oh, it's formed in carbonate rock and formed by the process of water erosion. Carbonate rock is susceptible to acid. Rainwater naturally is slightly acidic, and so therefore it's very easy for it to make huge cave complexes. And when people think of caves, carbonate caves are really what they're talking about. We don't get that type of cave in our mountains here, for example, because the rock's not right. So this is a huge cave complex. He's presenting on this, and I'm sitting in the audience thinking, I did a field trip last week, and I have 2 people in my class of 500 who are in wheelchairs, and this is an optional trip. I said, come join us on the trip, I said to the whole class. And if these students had come to me, I would have said, no, you can't come, because we don't have a lift on the bus and it wouldn't be safe. And after watching this guy's presentation, I was thinking to myself, well, what a jerk I am. Because my field trip, like, he's taking people down in an elevator and having them map in this really difficult environment. I would just have to throw a lift on the bus. Like, 80% of our stops are in a parking lot. It's like as accessible as it could be. And I suddenly realized, I need to be involved in this group. This is the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. And we were just building the group up then. And as part of the discussions, there was going to be a conference in Vancouver. And they said, well, why don't we try and do an accessible trip? And I said, perfect. I can run this. And the most difficult thing was getting a bus with a lift. And in fact, 2 days before the trip, the bus company called us in a panic and said, you're going outside of Vancouver and you're having accessible students. We can't let you do this. The liability's too high. You'd have to pay for more insurance. And they were trying to cancel us. And I said, oh, well, how much was the extra insurance? And they went, $100. I'm like, we're paying $2,000 for the bus already. Like, great, we'll pay an extra $100. I'll pay it out of my pocket. But they were like that's the sort of interesting barrier that you get. And this is this is a bus with a lift, and they didn't want to take people on the bus that's designed to take people to accessible areas, right?
And this is important for other people to listen to, because sometimes geology can go off the beaten track. You're on dirt roads and everything else. This is 100% on paved roads, well-maintained, like...
There's a couple places where people scrambled down, but when we did that, if someone was had mobility issues, we paired them with someone who didn't. And so they would go down and collect a sample and bring it back. And we just tried to sort of make sure that everybody had some amount of access. And you can't have perfect access, but you could say, hey, come with us. So this trip was fascinating from that perspective, because it felt very easy once I actually had the idea that I could do it. But it was groundbreaking in that people didn't do things like this. And the really funny thing that we didn't consider, when most of the people on the trip are disabled, nobody is disabled. Everybody had a different disability. This is very different than when you're trying to apply it to a class where you might have one or two people with a disability and they feel singled out. And so that's one of the struggles moving forward. But that trip was totally fascinating. And we had people with a wide variety of disabilities. We had 2 people who were visually impaired. We had a man who was almost completely deaf. And we got ourselves an ASL, American Sign Language translator for this. And then we discovered that he was from India and he didn't speak American Sign Language. but it actually worked out well, because that student who was the translator just sat next to him with a tablet and just was typing what people were saying at all times around him. And so he was getting the gist of what was going on, and he felt incredibly included because he could participate. There was someone next to him who was constantly translating for him, and he could read some lips and then get the gist of what was happening, and he would sit in the front of the bus and just smile and nod when we were talking about stuff, right? And so it was this really fascinating experience where we had a bunch of people who were very apprehensive about being on the field trip who ended up having this awesome time, and the feedback, the data that we'll talk about later, was phenomenal. Yeah.
In fact, that's where we're going right now.
Sounds great.
The data, I being, a volcanologist, and, really been... Yeah, I mean, it's not always that the data gives you a direct answer, because sometimes the answer is incredibly fuzzy.
Yeah.
But it's different. And then when you typically think of science, you're thinking of, like, lots of data. And I'm totally ignorant of this. I've sunk my proverbial teeth into only one other study for this show of a smaller sample size. And one event means only those who attended. So how can we put like that data or numbers here into context?
Yeah, so it's one of the constant interesting things about academia is this struggle between qualitative and quantitative data. And I was once in a research talk where we spent an hour talking about the value of qualitative data and how even having one person's account can be seen as a valid data source, and you can learn from that one person's account. And then someone came in late. We were talking about this qualitative project where they had five people had given qualitative interviews, and the person who came in late said, "Oh, it's too bad you didn't get enough numbers." Like, even with qualitative data, people think, oh, well, then you can bin it and make it quantitative, and we only believe in quantitative data. You got to have a number on it. And so part of what's exciting about this work was this phenomenology that they call it, exploring the experience of people. And we did have quite large numbers when you look at things. So we had focus groups both before and after, and we had groups of students, and then we had groups of professors. And we basically just tried to typify their experience in this context to elucidate, how doing a trip like this changed these people's lives, because it was very transformative for several of them. And like, I read the papers now years later and they still bring me to tears, some of them.
Tears.
Some of the quotes are just spectacular. I wasn't the slowest. Everyone wasn't waiting for me. One professor said it's the first time I've been able to be on a field trip in years. He had a progressive disability, and he'd go on trips and just sit on the bus. just to be close enough to the geology. And here he was there, and he and I were arguing about whether it was water or glaciers that carved this thing, you know. And that experience is something he missed. We had a visually impaired student who was going into geophysics, and when people asked, "What are you majoring in?" she would say, "Oh, I'm going to go in geophysics," and they would go, "Oh, honey, why are you making it hard on yourself?" And she said, "It feels like I'm giving people the wrong answer because science is too hard for someone with a disability." And, you know, and from this person, you know, who arrived, had a seeing eye dog that was brand new to them and like was struggling to get it on the bus and afraid to ask for help, to the end of the day where we're standing next to an outcrop and halfway up the hill, the little scramble is an intrusive dike, and at the end of the day, she was comfortable enough to just turn to someone she didn't know who they was and say, "Here, hold my dog," and then scrambled up the cliff by herself, following somebody. And one of the observers on the trip came up behind me and said, "All the risk analysis people at my university just died of a heart attack." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine. She's comfortable. It's not actually that dangerous." But, you know, like, it was really transformative for people who haven't had that experience. And she, as an example, said, "I now feel like I can do this. Whereas before I felt like I was giving people the wrong answer when I said geophysics."
Wow.
Right?
Okay, I mean, you saw my facial expressions, but I didn't want to interrupt you at all throughout any of that. And I was definitely giving some colorful expressions like shock and awe and like, wow.
Me too.
Wow.
Me too.
I mean, you weren't just now, but I bet you were at the time, or at least internalizing it.
Yeah.
And
I wasn't at the focus group. I got to read it later, and it's like, oh, that's great.
Oh,
you know?
So you, although lived the experience of this event, you didn't realize the impact it had until well after.
I did, because we talked about it a lot, and I did on the day of, and, you know, I spoke to people on the day of who were just like, "Thank you." And,
right.
you know, it was very strange for us, because it really, like, it wasn't hard, and that was one of the big takeaways. It's not like we did some Herculean task here. I got a bus with a lift, and I was prepared for people who had other disabilities. And we had a variety, as I said. We had some veterans from the U.S. who had trauma, like brain trauma from explosions. We had people with mental disabilities. We had learning disabilities. There was a woman who was supposed to be on another field trip, and that field trip left early without her. And we're like, "Well, come with us." And she was on the trip, and she sort of became part of the group. And about halfway through the day, she goes, "Wait a minute, I have chronic back pain. I have a disability." Right? I mean, and like, most of us hope to live long enough to become disabled, right? I mean, this is what all of our lives are going to be. But we have this strange focus on ability. No one can scale a 500-meter cliff, but that technically is a disability. Glasses are a disability, but glasses are so perfect that they're not really an issue, and people even wear them, you know, to look cool. Glasses that have no prescription in them, right? It's different than a hearing aid.
I have never worn my glasses to look cool.
Several people wear glasses for fashion. People do
I mean, sunglasses, sure.
But also people wear glasses that don't have a prescription in them because they don't have the connotation of growing up and feeling different, right?
Oh my gosh, the number of times I got called Four Eyes, or...
Of course.
I would beat the crap out of you. Just, you're wearing glasses, so I'll give it a pass because I feel sorry for you.
I always say, my mother said, never be afraid to sucker punch a girl just because she's wearing glasses. I will say she gets very angry when I say that.
So... obviously, you've just kind of gone through a little bit of like how it really did work for the students, but which clearly it did. But did it impact what could be taught?
So this is one of the things that people were worried about. I would argue that a traditional field trip is not actually a great learning environment. You know, the way I went through, it was great. But, you know, when I went through field trips in my undergrad, we would drive somewhere and someone would lecture at us, and maybe we would write notes and produce a report on what they had said. And that's not an ideal learning situation. So the way that this trip worked, and we did the same thing for all trips, and I do this on all my trips now still, we go to the location, I say get in groups, and go explore the area. And specific to this, we added the phrase, use all of your senses to explore the area. And we would do that, and people would see different things and feel different things and do different stuff and even be able to go to different places. The very first stop had a ramp that went down to the seawall. And that ramp said, no wheelchairs, because it was quite steep. And we had one person in a scooter and this woman who was in a wheelchair. And I walked them over, I said, it's up to you if you want to go down here. And the person on the scooter said no, and turned around and went back to a platform where they could observe what's happening. And the woman on the wheelchair, I said, are you okay with that? And she eyed me, popped a wheelie, and then rode down the hill pulling the wheelie while eyeballing me as they went down the hill. I'm like, okay. Everyone has a different level of risk tolerance. And obviously she was fine, right? And so she could get down closer to the material and look at other certain things. And so, but that idea that what we're doing is we're exploring this area, we're all finding different things. I specifically said, bring back samples to the people who can't make it down, have a discussion, show what you know. And it really lent that community. And then we would come back and say, okay, well, what did we discover? And we had a field trip handout that maybe had a couple guiding questions for each spot. But as an example, the first stop we would go to is Third Beach at Stanley Park, where you can look at the sand. There's little indicators of landslides. At the far end of the beach is a sandstone outcrop that's Eocene aged and fluvial. There's groins on the beach to protect sand from longshore drift. There's a long view of the Salish Sea where you can see weather coming a long way. We can talk about huge windstorms that affected Stanley Park. There's a whole bunch of things to look at, and especially having a diverse group of geoscientists, you got really interesting discussion, and people were excited because everybody learned something from someone else. So I still do that with first years. They're a little shyer, but they observe things,
All right. Well, I'll leave the jargon in there alone for our non-geology listeners.
Oh, sorry.
But I do remember, the one thing that I truly remember that was grilled into me via these sorts of field trips that you're describing was describe, 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 describe.
Yeah.
That was which is, to be
fair, it's the
fair,
learning goal verb that we love the most in geology.
So it almost seems like I'm a generation ahead of you, because the way you make it seem, it's that the next crew of teachers learned to, use your senses, talk about what you feel, what you see, and you're just taking it that next step further as part of the study.
I literally had the classic where we drove an hour, we got out of the bus, and the professor said, behind this concrete wall is the best example of an outcrop. Well, it's not here anymore because they covered it, but he drove us there and then talked about it. I had another professor in the Channel Scablands, which is an area of huge basalt and beautiful columnar basalts and features. They're gorgeous, like Giant's Causeway, who we went to 8 different locations, and in a trip of 40 people held up an 8.5 by 11 geochemical Excel graph and talked for 45 minutes about the geochemistry of these rocks.
What?
Which was the most horrifying field trip I've ever been on in my life.
I have never been on anything that could approach that monstrosity of terribleness.
Well, I'm an angry old man, Jeff.
Wow. You've lived through some stuff.
I've seen some stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
but that idea of having activities and doing things there, and describe is part of it. But we go for, especially with the first year trip, what do you observe, and then what can you interpret from that? And we try not to get too far into the just take some notes.
Well, I mean, what do you observe? That's the describe, right?
It is. Although it's a little friendlier to the students.
Sure.
Because describe is, you want to find the thing that I want you to find, whereas what do you observe is literally, what do you see here? What's interesting to you? What stands out?
It's funny. I never got that impression. The impression that I got from describe was write down everything you notice. Everything. It doesn't matter if it's useful or not.
Well, that's good.
And now interpret. And if your interpretation is wrong, as long as your description has everything there, you can always reinterpret.
Fair. Yeah.
And you can thank Kelly Russell, which is also a UBC professor, actually, even though there is, I guess, maybe not at the faculty level, never at the faculty level, but the institution level from where I graduated to at SFU to UBC, there is some kind of competition, I guess.
So having come from SFU, I know from SFU's perspective that UBC is the rival school. And having been at UBC, UBC occasionally remembers that there are two universities in the Lower Mainland, which I find very adorable.
It is very adorable, but that's almost an aside because I want to get back to what we're talking about and kind of switch it on its head, because the other part of the whole story is the staff or the teachers. Were they surprised about how it all went, and what did they say?
Well, and we thought it would all be teachers who were able-bodied paired with disabled students, or students with disabilities, I should say. But it wasn't, because many of the professors had disabilities, and their discussions were interesting. For example, the professors spent a lot of time trying to define disability, which was an interesting part of their discussion. And several of them had a disability and were still grappling with this thing. But yeah, many of them also had a similar experience, like, oh, I didn't feel like I was a bother. But this idea that they were also trying to think through the meta level of, like, who gets to be here and who belongs and which disabilities are valid, which was a very interesting discussion and does mirror professors without disabilities as well. Like, which disability is valid, right? Like,
wow, that is so human.
Right? Like, someone in a wheelchair, has a mobility disability. But somebody who has, like, a chronic pain, who appears not to have a disability, that's a much different problem. We did, years later, we did a similar trip to Mammoth Cave, coming full circle. And they brought a photographer to take pictures of the trip. And I was watching the photographer at the first stop. We were actually inside the cave. And he kept taking pictures of the two people in wheelchairs. And I finally went over to him and said, hey. He goes, yeah. I go, everybody on this trip has a disability. And he went, what? Because the photographer was only thinking of the people in wheelchairs.
And so I guess the professors, or the ones that were in the lecturer position, were also struggling with this idea.
Yeah. It's a hard idea. Disability is a hard thing to define, and we tend to, as a knee-jerk reaction in our society, consider it as a medical model. This is a deficiency that medicine can cure. Or this is an identity rather than this is an attribute that a human has, right? It's very, and I'm being inarticulate as someone who is mostly able-bodied. I'm coming to these ideas late, obviously. Like, I was the person who would have said, no, you can't come on the trip because you're in a wheelchair. Which the regret I have about this is staggering. It's kind of amazing.
But, I mean, that's, I guess, one of the wonderful things about science is having the curiosity to ask questions and learn, right?
Yeah.
And maybe this is something I'm coming to late, even within the podcast, is in science we try so hard to remove the human from the whole conversation. And maybe the human doesn't need to be in the equation, but you can't remove them from the conversation.
Yeah. I often start out my first year classes by reminding them that they are, in fact, a bag of meat. And the meat is driving. And if you're tired or hungry or cranky, like, that's a thing you have to consider as a scientist, is how that affects you. I remember my professor saying to me, oh, don't go out in the rain, because you won't be able to trust the data. You're going to have to go back and remeasure those things because you're going to do a bad job. And I thought that was a really sort of interesting perspective. It's hard in Vancouver if you're in the winter, but it's an interesting perspective that you want to plan what your fieldwork is so that it's things you can rely on. And remembering that if you're cold and your hands are shaking, you're not going to be working hard on getting that fracture measurement the way you might on a beautiful sunny day.
So moving forward, given your position in the pedagogy of the Earth Science Department at UBC, I assume some of this is being incorporated into the classroom writ large, and I guess into the field trips as well?
Yeah, so in this classroom there's an architectural term called universal design. So for example, a sliding automatic door makes life easier for everyone, but is also helpful for people with disability. And so you want to universal design things that affect the broadest amount of people. So in universal design for learning, for example, having a white background with black text and high contrast makes it easier for people with visual disabilities, but also makes it easier for everyone. If you have a yellow background and red text, that's hard to read, right? And so that's one of the ways that it goes in there. It's very tricky. Making a class accessible is not like a one and done, because so often the accommodations you want to make for people are going to be unique. The way one person who's visually impaired deals with their disability is going to be different than another. One of the people on that trip actually has a genetic deterioration of the cones or the rods, I forget which, in her eye, and she is an identical twin, but her deterioration started earlier, so she was completely blind at 18 and spent much of her life pretending not to have deterioration of vision. Well, her sister's vision didn't go until like 29. So this friend of mine, you can't tell that she's almost completely blind. And when you talk, she'll look you in the eye, which is awesome. Her sister tries to do it and can't. And they both have a very different expression of genetically identical disabilities, right? So how you accommodate people is tricky. And what's challenging for us at the university is you often find out about accommodations on the first day. So you aren't finding out in June that you're going to have a person who's visually impaired in your paleontology lab, for example. You find out on September 5th that happens. And that makes that difficult. And so communities like the International Association for Geoscience Diversity are wonderful. We have these listservs that are super quiet. And then September and January are flooded with people saying, I have a person with this disability in this class. Does anyone have resources? How do you show three-dimensional models to a student with a disability? I was very lucky, or with a visual disability. I was very lucky to have a TA once who was hired as a note taker for a person with low vision. And I handed her a pile of silly putty one day, and she was able to quickly shape the silly putty into things that this person could touch. And so he was able to see the three-dimensional things because he could hold them.
Oh, wow.
And she had just come up with it on the fly because I happened to hand her some silly putty so he could feel it.
I would not be able to create that.
I wouldn't have either. But she
awesome.
had the bandwidth and was hired to try to accommodate for him and was a really keen and engaged note taker in the ability to do this. And so now I know if I have a student with a visual disability, I need to make sure they're paired with someone who has silly putty.
And the ability to quickly shape something reasonable.
It's rough and ready, right?
Sure, to a point, but
yeah, it's got to be something. But so it turns out things like paleontology are actually wonderful.
Yeah.
Because there's actually several well-known blind paleontologists because you can really feel the fossils, right?
Yeah.
And so it's knowing where those things are more useful and where in some cases might actually be an advantage.
Okay. So I suppose it's time to kind of circle back to the problem in a different way.
Okay.
As framed at the top, I think by and large, science, we buy in. We realize we want, at least, again, this is by and large the community as a whole as opposed to the individual. We want to make things better. That is,
yes.
We want to learn things better. We want to, move forward our understanding. Let's change the world for a better. At least that's the sentiment. Mm-hmm. But we also have this other side of us, which is also too slow to move.
Yeah.
So, in practice, are we starting to see things change?
Definitely. Hugely so. So, we did this paper years ago. Lots of people have...
How many years ago?
10, I think, was 2015 was the original work, the field trip. The last paper was 2018 or 19 when it was published. When we finally got, I think it was the professor's paper was finally published. We had some trouble getting it published for bad reasons. Anyway.
Reviewer 3.
Pardon me?
Reviewer 3. It's always Reviewer 3.
Yeah, Reviewer 3 had no experience with accessibility and was challenging us on definitions in really ableist ways. And we actually eventually pulled from that paper and went somewhere else, which was, we were kind of laughing about it, but it spread things out nicely. But no, things have changed a lot. So in our department, for example, the Faculty of Science has a program every summer where you can basically apply and you can join the Universal Design for Learning Scholars Program and rework one of your courses to be more accessible. So for example, I think the first project we did a few years ago, they redesigned mineralogy to account for a fairly common disability, color blindness, which is a struggle in mineralogy. Not as much as it could be, but color can be important.
Yeah, especially in biology and under the microscope. Holy smokes.
Yeah, and so knowing how to deal with that, we now have that built into this lab. So that's an example of the type of thing that's happening. There's been a lot of good work done in my department alone, because I've been doing this work. When a student with a disability enters third year field school, the professors immediately come to me and say, okay, well, what can we do here? And how can we help this person? And, COVID actually in some ways helped this a lot, because we had to struggle with the idea of online learning. And so there's days in the field, in our field school, where if someone can't go, potentially just because they've been injured and rolled their ankle, they can instead do the online module for that day, which that's great.
Yeah.
The fact that we have this alternate process. We also are more likely, I think 10 years ago, if someone said, I can't do field school, we would have said, you can't be a geologist. Whereas now people are more open to finding alternatives. And there are alternative field schools that are built around accessibility. So a colleague of mine, Anita Marshall, from the University of Florida, I think, somewhere in Florida, has an accessible field school that's modeled after NASA missions. And so they split the class into two groups. And one of the groups is mission control. And they might even be at home. And they're interacting completely in an online setting. And they design what the day is going to be. And they design what the plan is going to be. And the people who are able-bodied and able to be there, they're the ones who are actually doing the away mission, as it were. Or the... And it's a beautiful design, and then everyone works together to produce an output. And
how often do they have Miami? We have a problem.
Right, exactly. They actually go to Arizona.
Right.
But yeah,
the people are back in Florida, right? I don't know where.
Or Seattle, or wherever. And so we sent a student there from Vancouver who actually went down and was part of the away team, a student who had a variety of disabilities that didn't affect their mobility. And so they were able to participate in this, right? And so that's an example of the type of things that are happening. I think people being really creative. And I think, the thing about accessibility, when I said, you can't, or when I would have said, you can't come, that's A, rude, but B, probably illegal and would open the university up to like a Charter of Right and Freedoms challenge, right? Like I'm required to have something that they could do, right? And in the U.S., Title IX, I think the laws are called, like that you have these things where you're required to accommodate. And accommodation doesn't mean make it perfect. It's to do something that makes them involved and helps them replace the learning. And that's what's happening more, I find. So there's hope.
Before we move on to some of the lighter side of things, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's a conversation that we don't have enough in sciences, as like between sciences, like between scientists in the open. It does happen, but it's never like fully out in the open. Like, and I don't know about you, and I'm not willing to get into it ever in a public sphere. There is a lot of stuff that goes on in academia, and not necessarily with the colleagues right beside you, but like as an institutional level where you're kind of like, damn, we really need to do more.
Yeah, and I think we're getting a lot better. I think that things are less likely to happen and have the bad outcome. We're more likely to have people accommodated. We have the Centers for Accessibility, which is common everywhere. They're mostly focused on exams. But for people with more severe disabilities, like my students who are visually impaired, they do other things and they focus on lecture. So I think improvements are having. In one of our lecture rooms, there's a sign on it. There's an office chair, a rotating, comfortable office chair with a sign on it that says, please leave this here. This is for students with disabilities, a specific disability, who can't sit on the hard plastic chair. You know, you see this more and more often. So it does give me hope.
Okay, so with the harder side of the conversation done, do you know you have an IMDB page?
I did not.
Oh,
when you told me, I went and looked it up.
Yeah, so as longtime listeners know, I actually do give a fair bit of the questions, not all of them, to the guest ahead of time. And this was one of the questions you saw. So you did not know you had one.
No. And then I looked at it and I think, it must be that Global News automatically uploads all interviews, which is funny because it makes me want to go in there and put in like the Czech and the CTV and the CBC, maybe throw on. I have a one ridiculous YouTube video that a colleague of mine who is a little more tech savvy filmed me answering questions, frequently asked questions from students and generally being a goof. And he titled it Brett Geodude Gilley, which I find very funny.
Okay. Well, thus far, you haven't been terribly funny on the podcast, but to be fair, it's because of the context of what we're talking about. So you need to send me that link so I can put it in the show notes.
Okay. Great.
I'm serious. I'm going to hold you to that.
I will send it to you. It's horrifying.
But do you have plans to be a film star or a comedian based on this page?
No, not so much. Not yet. I mean, the hope is always there, right? I will say, having taught classes, there's been times where I taught like a quarter of all UBC students took one of my classes. We had like 2,000 people a year were taking our natural disasters course. And so there's this weird minor celebrity that would make me never want to be a celebrity. I could not go to a restaurant near UBC without having a server come up to me and say, "Hey, I took your class." And that's weird. And that parasocial relationship is really strange. So I'm not aiming for being a comedian or a movie star anytime soon. But I'm happy to play Geologist number 2 in the background if they need someone to swing a hammer.
Geologist number 2?
Yeah. I mean, Glyn Williams-Jones famously has his hand in the movie Supervolcano.
Is it famous? But at any rate, we have totally got into inside baseball. Glyn Williams-Jones, as we know, if you've a longtime listener, we've had him early on this year in January. We're talking about Mount Meager, was my PhD supervisor. And we're just throwing some shade there.
He literally was in the movie.
But he literally was in the movie, and he was their science attaché, which they partly ignored him or mostly ignored him.
It's a pretty good, as far as volcano movies go, that one did pretty well. They mostly stayed true to the science. It's not like Volcano, for example, which is, I don't know what they're doing there.
Yeah, but at least it was entertaining.
Yes, it's true.
Terrible, but entertaining. But now we're at the perfect point of the whole show where you get to do any call-outs, projects, coworkers, other studies. Maybe your favorite rock of the week?
Don't take me for granted because I'm nice.
That's not your joke, I hope, because that's
not my
coming.
joke. No, that's okay. A classic. No, I would call out something I've mentioned a couple times. The International Association for Geoscience Diversity is an international group that works towards making geology more accessible for people with disabilities. And just recently, they created a Canada chapter. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to go and see if they can join the Canadian chapter of the IAGD. Yeah.
Okay. That leaves only the infamous final question. Your favorite science joke?
I mean, I told you my one earlier, just gravity sucks. But that one's not really my favorite. That's more just I like to say a stupid joke in front of 200 people and hear the dead silence.
Oh, I love that. Actually, you know what? Yeah. When I taught, it was like one of the funny things is that I would say something that I thought was objectively funny, and I thought for sure it was funny, and then you'd hear silence. Like a pin could drop. And then you're like, and I would literally say this, I know that was bad, but I didn't get a word. And then all of a sudden the whole class 200, 300 people would start laughing. And I was like, did I need to give you permission?
Yeah, the classroom's a strange place. I once had a class that did not once laugh the entire semester. Dead silence. I was like going a little crazy, like waiting for my laughter and not getting it. And at the end of the term, every single student talked about how funny I was in the
How big was the
evaluations.
class?
30.
Oh, okay.
It was just really weird. Classes have weird culture, right? So,
Yeah.
My favorite science joke. Yeah. So I tell this in my disasters class. We often talk about, if you ask a geologist where to build a house, the geologist will say, don't bother. It won't even last 10,000 years. But if you ask an engineer where to build a house, they'll say, how much money do you have? And I like that one because it talks a little about the mindset of geologists and engineers who are constantly in some sort of strange battle.
Yeah, still covered by the same professional designation group.
That's right, but not the same procedures.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come on Whimsical Wavelengths.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If this topic is something you want to get further into, please check out the show notes for some of the links, including the YouTube video mentioned about Professor Brett Gilley here, Geodude. And remember, I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
In a world so chaotic, so misbehaved, echoes of melodies remind us it's all waves. Colors weave stories painting the sky, swaying to rhythms as the galaxies fly by.